The laughter started before the building moved. Raymond Mercer stood near the back of the grand unveiling ballroom, still wearing his dust-stained masonry jacket, while investors in black tuxedos stared at him like he had wandered into the wrong world by mistake. Above them, the glass crown of the $500 million skyscraper shimmered against the Chicago night sky. "You're a bricklayer," Elliot Vane said loudly enough for the cameras nearby to hear. "Not a structural engineer." A few people smirked. One woman actually laughed. Ray tightened his grip on the worn tool bag hanging from his shoulder. A faded yellow scarf knitted by his daughter peeked from the side pocket. He did not argue. He only looked past Elliot, toward the suspended glass panels lining the upper atrium. The movement was almost invisible, a ripple, too rhythmic, too precise. "The tower's transferring force unevenly," Ray said quietly. Elliot rolled his eyes and motioned for security. Then it happened. The marble floor trembled beneath hundreds of polished shoes. Champagne glasses rattled. Somewhere deep above them, steel groaned like a living thing under pressure. And suddenly, nobody was laughing anymore. "Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you enjoy cinematic stories about quiet strength, dignity, and impossible moments, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the ending of Ray Mercer's story." End of Part 1. Part 2. At 5:12 every morning before Chicago fully woke up, Raymond Mercer sat at the small kitchen table beside the window and drank his coffee in silence. Not because he liked silence, because silence was cheaper than exhaustion. The apartment was old enough that the pipes knocked inside the walls every winter morning. The heater hissed unevenly. The linoleum near the sink had begun peeling at the corners years ago, but Ray kept pressing it back flat with the heel of his boot every few days, like stubbornness alone could hold things together. Across from him, Sophie sat wrapped in a faded, oversized sweatshirt, carefully brushing her hair while reading from a school script spread across the table. Her yellow knitted scarf hung loosely around her neck, despite the apartment already being warm. She wore it constantly, especially on stressful days. "You nervous?" Ray asked quietly. Sophie shrugged without looking up. "Only the normal amount." "That bad, huh?" That earned a small smile. The smile mattered. 3 years earlier, there had been months where Ray would have traded everything he owned just to see that smile one more time beneath hospital lights. Chemotherapy had left Sophie smaller than other kids her age for a while. Frailer, quieter. There were still nights when Ray woke suddenly because some part of him remembered machines beeping in dark hospital rooms. Fear did not always leave when the danger did. Sometimes it simply learned how to sleep lighter. Sophie folded her paper script carefully. "You're still coming tonight, right?" Ray looked at the clock automatically, then toward the weather report glowing silently from the old television in the corner. Heavy lakefront winds. Again. His expression changed just slightly, almost invisibly, but Sophie noticed anyway. "You promised," she said softly. Ray nodded immediately. "I know, not a work promise." A pause, a real promise. That one landed harder. Ray leaned forward and adjusted the scarf around her neck with rough hands permanently marked by mortar dust and old cuts. "A real promise," he said. Sophie studied him for another second, deciding whether to believe him. Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out something folded carefully between school papers. A small paper card. Inside was a simple drawing done in colored pencil years ago during one of her hospital recovery programs. A lighthouse, crooked lines, uneven yellow coloring, tiny waves. On the back in childish handwriting, "For Dad. So you always find your way back." Ray looked at it longer than most people would have. "You still carry that thing?" Sophie asked. "Every day. You're sentimental for a construction guy. Don't spread that around." That finally made her laugh. Outside the city, trains rumbled awake beneath gray winter clouds. Ray stood, grabbed his worn work jacket, and slung his heavy tool bag over one shoulder. The yellow scarf drawing disappeared carefully into an inner pocket near his chest. Not shoved. Placed, like something fragile, like something alive. The Vane Meridian Tower stood above downtown Chicago like it had been designed to intimidate the sky itself. Glass, steel, perfect symmetry, the kind of building created for magazine covers and billionaire speeches. At street level, however, beauty looked different. Beauty looked like welders arriving before sunrise. Concrete crews drinking coffee beside portable heaters. Maintenance workers carrying equipment through freezing wind tunnels between unfinished service corridors. Ray belonged to that version of the building, not the glamorous one. He spent most nights inspecting exterior masonry transition joints, connecting older historic structures to the new tower complex. Quiet work, dangerous work, the kind nobody noticed unless it failed. By 7:40 a.m., Ray was already 50 feet above the lower service annex, examining expansion seams, while icy wind pushed against the scaffolding. Below him, luxury vehicles lined up for the evening unveiling gala. Media trucks, private security, caterers, investors, all arriving to celebrate Elliot Vane's masterpiece. Ray pressed gloved fingers lightly against a steel-braced masonry seam, then stopped. Something vibrated beneath the surface. Not random. Rhythmic. His eyes narrowed. Far above, nearly 90 stories overhead, the tower's upper crown vanished into low gray clouds. Wind curled around the structure differently today. The movement traveled downward through the frame in subtle pulses. Most people would never notice. But Ray had spent decades listening to buildings. Old buildings creaked. Weak buildings shook. Dangerous buildings repeated themselves. He pulled a flashlight from his belt and angled it along the seam. Fine gray dust drifted downward from a connection point where there should have been none. Not enough for panic, enough for concern. A younger worker named Luis climbed the scaffold toward him, carrying fresh anchors. "You see that too?" Luis asked quietly. Ray nodded once. Luis swallowed. "You think it's bad?" Ray looked up again toward the invisible upper floors. "I think something's carrying force wrong." Luis frowned. "Should we report it?" "We will." Luis hesitated. Both of them already knew how that conversation would probably go. Because men in tailored suits rarely enjoyed hearing structural concerns from workers covered in mortar dust, especially during launch week. Still, Ray reached for his radio. Below them, giant LED screens flickered alive across the entrance plaza. "Welcome to the future of Chicago luxury." Ray stared at the tower another few seconds. Then the building moved again. Just slightly. A soft vibration beneath steel and stone, like a heartbeat missing rhythm. And for the first time that morning, something cold settled quietly into his chest. By late afternoon, the Vane Meridian Tower no longer looked like a construction site. It looked like a kingdom. Black luxury SUVs lined the curved entrance drive beneath heated awnings, while photographers crowded behind velvet barriers waiting for Chicago's elite to arrive. Giant crystal chandeliers glowed through 90-foot glass walls. Catering staff in white uniforms moved with military precision across polished marble floors that reflected light like water. And somewhere beneath all that luxury, hidden behind decorative walls and imported stone, the tower continued trembling. Subtly, rhythmically, wrong. Raymond Mercer stood inside a narrow service corridor near the eastern structural spine, with one gloved hand resting against exposed steel. Feeling it, listening. Most people heard noise inside buildings. Ray heard patterns. He closed his eyes briefly as another vibration traveled through the frame. Not wind alone. Something else was feeding it back. A young site engineer hurried past, carrying a tablet. Ray stopped him gently. "Hold up a second." The engineer looked impatient already. "What?" "You monitoring harmonic response from the upper damper system." The younger man blinked. "Why?" Ray pointed upward slightly. Frequency changed after noon. The engineer gave him a confused look. You can tell that by standing here. Ray did not answer immediately, because the truthful answers sounded ridiculous, unless someone had spent decades around structures under stress. Instead, he said quietly, "Something's amplifying movement." The engineer glanced toward Ray's dust-covered jacket tool belt and work gloves. Then he gave the same look Ray had seen his entire life. Dismissal dressed as politeness. "I'll let the consultants know," the man said quickly before walking away. Ray watched him disappear down the corridor. He already knew what would happen next. Nothing. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. At 6:10 p.m. Elliot Vane arrived, and the entire atmosphere of the building shifted around him. The famous architect stepped from a black town car wearing a charcoal overcoat, and the relaxed confidence of a man accustomed to entering rooms where everyone already admired him. Cameras exploded in flashes. Investors moved closer. Executives straightened automatically. Elliot Vane was not merely wealthy. He was celebrated. Magazine profiles called him the man redesigning the American skyline. Universities invited him to lecture about urban innovation. Business journals praised his ability to turn steel and glass into symbols of power. Tonight was supposed to be another victory. The unveiling of his newest masterpiece, a $500 million declaration standing over downtown Chicago. Inside the grand lobby, Elliot moved through groups of investors while discussing design philosophy with effortless charm. "Buildings should inspire emotional certainty," he said smoothly. "People should feel protected the second they enter them." Several guests nodded admiringly. Above them, hidden behind decorative ceiling panels, steel groaned softly. Ray heard it from 30 feet away. His eyes lifted immediately. Again, too rhythmic, too clean. Like the tower was repeating the same mistake over and over. He moved toward one of the operations supervisors standing near the elevator banks. "Martin." The supervisor turned. "What now, Ray?" "We need to slow upper occupancy." Martin sighed instantly. "No, the damping system's compensating wrong." Martin lowered his voice. "You cannot walk up to me during an investor gala talking like that." "I'm serious." "So am I." Martin rubbed his forehead impatiently. "You're a masonry repair worker, Ray. We already have structural consultants upstairs." Ray stayed calm. "The tower's feeding movement back into itself." Martin gave a tired laugh. "Jesus." Nearby executives overheard enough to glance over. One smirked. Another shook his head. And unfortunately, at that exact moment, Elliot Vane himself approached from behind the crowd. "What's going on?" Nobody answered immediately. Martin forced an uncomfortable smile. "Nothing major. Just one of the maintenance guys worrying about vibrations." Elliot looked at Ray for the first time, really looked at him. The worn gloves, dust-stained jacket, old boots carrying traces of dried mortar. Not a man Elliot would normally notice twice. "Vibrations," Elliot repeated. Ray nodded once. "Upper harmonic response is increasing." A few nearby guests exchanged amused looks immediately. Elliot almost smiled. "And you diagnosed this personally?" "Yes." "With what exactly?" Ray glanced toward the ceiling. "Experience." That earned a small laugh from someone in the crowd. Elliot folded his arms slowly. "You're a bricklayer. Masonry and structural reinforcement. You lay bricks." The words landed louder this time. People nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Ray remained still. Elliot stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the humiliation feel intimate while still public. "Do you know how many engineers worked on this tower?" Ray said nothing. "How many simulations?" Still nothing. "How many internationally certified specialists signed off on this building?" Another soft ripple of laughter passed through the nearby investors. Ray could feel eyes moving across him now, measuring him, judging him, dismissing him. But he did not react. Because pride was expensive when you had a daughter depending on you. Elliot turned partly toward the crowd with a polished smile. "I think Chicago is safe from emergency structural advice delivered by the brickwork department." That one got a bigger laugh. Even Martin smiled nervously. Ray lowered his eyes briefly, not in shame, in restraint. Inside his jacket pocket, his fingers brushed the folded lighthouse drawing Sophie had made years ago. "For Dad." "So you always find your way back." He inhaled once, slowly, then looked back at Elliot. "The tower doesn't care who's right," Ray said quietly. That line almost annoyed Elliot more than open defiance would have, because there was no anger in it, no desperation, only certainty. Elliot's expression hardened slightly. "Enjoy the rest of your shift, Mr. Mercer." Then he walked away toward applause and camera flashes. The crowd moved with him instantly, like gravity following money. Ray remained standing near the elevators alone. A few workers nearby avoided eye contact entirely. Luis approached carefully several seconds later. "You okay?" Ray nodded once, but his eyes were already lifting upward again. Listening, feeling. The vibration returned. Stronger now. Far above the gala floor, hidden deep inside the upper crown of the skyscraper, massive tuned dampers had begun cycling harder against the increasing wind loads rolling off Lake Michigan. And suddenly Ray understood something that made the blood drain slowly from his face. The system was not stabilizing the tower. It was teaching the tower the wrong rhythm. Then somewhere high overhead, the building moved again. Hard enough this time for one of the chandelier crystals to tremble. The higher the guests climbed inside the vain Meridian Tower, the less they noticed the building moving. Luxury had a way of softening fear. Music helped too. So did champagne. By 7:30 that evening, the 86th floor gala ballroom shimmered with warm gold light, spilling across polished black marble and towering glass walls that overlooked the frozen Chicago River below. A live jazz quartet played near the suspended staircase, while investors drifted through conversations about real estate technology and money large enough to change skylines. Outside, the glass snow moved sideways across the dark city, and somewhere far above the ballroom ceiling, hidden inside the crown mechanical levels, the tower's stabilization system continued fighting itself. Raymond Mercer stepped out of a service elevator, carrying a diagnostic toolkit no one had asked him to bring. He moved quietly along the perimeter corridors behind the ballroom walls, while servers and hotel staff rushed past him without paying attention. Every few seconds, he paused beside structural columns, touching the steel lightly with his fingertips, listening again. The pattern had changed. Not stronger exactly, more coordinated. That worried him more, because chaotic movement could be corrected. Rhythmic failure spread. Ahead, two engineering consultants stood near an open control cabinet, reviewing vibration data on tablets. Their expensive, tailored coats and polished shoes looked almost absurd beside exposed utility piping and maintenance wiring. Ray recognized one of them immediately. Donna Halper, lead structural systems consultant, one of the most respected names in vertical stabilization engineering. She was brilliant, and at that moment, completely wrong. Ray approached carefully. "Your dampers are overcompensating on the west side." Donna barely looked up. "Excuse me." The timing cycle shifted. Now she looked at him, actually looked. Her eyes moved over the work jacket at the dust, the tool belt. "Maintenance, not engineering." "I'm sorry," she said politely. "Who are you?" "Ray Mercer." "And your role here?" "Masonry reinforcement and structural maintenance." One of the younger consultants nearby gave a tiny, amused smile immediately. Dana turned back toward her tablet. "We're handling it." Ray stayed calm. "The damping system's repeating load transfer too aggressively." "That's impossible." "It's happening." Dana sighed softly, the sound professionals made when they believed they were being patient with someone beneath them. "Mr. Mercer, the building is responding to high lakefront wind pressure, exactly as designed." Ray glanced toward the ceiling. "No," he said quietly. "It's amplifying rebound." The younger consultant chuckled under his breath. Dana crossed her arms. "Do you understand how many adaptive simulations were run before this tower opened?" Ray answered immediately. "Not enough if the transfer timing was altered after installation." That finally irritated her. "We appreciate your concern," she said sharply, "but structural resonance analysis is not masonry work." Ray did not react to the tone. He only looked toward the vibration graphs flashing across her tablet. Then his eyes narrowed slightly. The system curves were smoothing the peaks artificially. Filtered diagnostics. Someone had prioritized appearance stability over raw oscillation data. Dangerous. Very dangerous. Before he could respond, a soft vibration passed beneath the floor again. The hanging utility chains overhead trembled. 1, 2, 3 seconds. Too long. Ray looked directly at Dana. "Your tower's not absorbing force anymore." Donna's patience vanished. "It's a skyscraper in winter wind, Mr. Mercer." "Buildings move." "Yes," Ray said quietly. "But this one's learning the wrong movement." Silence. The younger consultant exchanged another smirk with his colleague. Donna closed the cabinet firmly. "We're done here." Then she walked away. The others followed immediately. Ray remained alone in the corridor as the vibration echoed faintly through steel around him. Not random. Never random. Like a song repeating the wrong note. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Inside the ballroom, Elliot Vane stood beneath massive crystal chandeliers, giving interviews to local media. "The future of urban luxury," he said confidently while cameras rolled, "is intelligent architecture that responds to human behavior in real time." Applause followed. Near the rear of the ballroom, one investor frowned slightly as wine inside his glass trembled in tiny circles. Another guest noticed a decorative hanging fixture swaying almost imperceptibly. Most ignored it. People trusted expensive things, especially when wealthy men stood beside them, smiling. Back in the service corridor, Ray pulled out his old phone. A text notification waited on the screen. From Sophie, a selfie. She stood backstage at school wearing her yellow scarf and holding a folded recital program with an anxious smile. "Don't forget this time." Ray stared at the photo longer than he should have. Guilt settled heavily in his chest. 3 missed recitals, 2 canceled school nights, 1 hospital follow-up appointment he'd arrived late for because of emergency overtime. Sophie never complained directly. That somehow made it worse. Ray typed back carefully with rough thumbs. "I'll be there." Another vibration moved through the wall beside him. Harder now. A maintenance panel rattled softly. Ray looked upward immediately, then toward the emergency stairwell leading to the upper mechanical floors. His instincts screamed at him. Not fear. Recognition. The kind that came only after years around structures, moments before failure. A nearby elevator opened suddenly, and several gala guests stepped out laughing loudly. The elevator doors hesitated halfway closed afterward, then reopened, then closed again. A tiny malfunction. But Ray noticed. Because systems began failing in small, embarrassed ways before they failed publicly. A hotel employee nearby frowned at the doors. "That's weird." Ray walked over immediately. He placed his hand lightly against the elevator frame. Vibration, repeating through the shaft. His expression darkened. Then overhead, a deep, metallic thud echoed somewhere, far above the ballroom ceiling. Not loud enough for panic. Loud enough for Ray. Guests paused briefly. The jazz music continued. Conversations resumed. But one of the chandelier crystals near the center of the ballroom had begun swaying visibly now. And on the 89th floor mechanical level, hidden inside the stabilization control network, the tower's adaptive damping system increased compensation again. Wrong direction. Wrong timing. Feeding movement back into the structure instead of bleeding it away. Ray closed his eyes briefly, then whispered the words almost to himself. The building's teaching itself to fall. And far above Chicago, the tower moved again. This time strong enough for several guests to finally notice. At first, the guests treated the movement like part of the experience. A luxury skyscraper above downtown Chicago was expected to sway slightly in winter wind. Some even joked about it while standing beside the towering glass walls with cocktails in hand. "It feels alive up here," one investor laughed. Another lifted his phone to record the skyline, shimmering beyond the snow-covered river below. But Raymond Mercer knew the difference between movement and instability. Movement breathed. Instability repeated. By 8:04 p.m., the repetition had become impossible for him to ignore. Ray stood alone inside a narrow mechanical access corridor near the tower's western stabilization systems, while icy wind moaned faintly through ventilation shafts overhead. Thick, insulated pipes lined the walls beside giant vibration control conduits running vertically through the structure. The entire building hummed now, not loudly, but constantly. His flashlight beam moved across monitoring labels and maintenance markings until it settled on a small digital service display mounted beside the damper access panel. Frequency compensation cycles flashed rapidly across the screen. Too rapidly. The system was chasing movement instead of controlling it. Ray exhaled slowly. Then he reached for the maintenance radio clipped to his jacket. "Control this is Mercer from West Mechanical." Static answered first. Then a bored dispatcher voice. "Go ahead. You need Dana Halper in the West Damping Corridor immediately." A pause. "What's the issue?" "The timing compensation is accelerating rebound." Another pause. "You mean vibration?" Ray closed his eyes briefly. The tower's sinking itself to the wind. Silence. Then, I'll pass it along. The line disconnected. Ray looked back at the monitor. The cycle numbers jumped again. Wrong. Wrong again. Like the building kept hearing a false instruction and obeying it harder each time. Footsteps approached from the corridor behind him. Donna Halper arrived with 2 engineers, and visible irritation already written across her face. I was in the middle of a presentation, she said sharply. Ray stepped aside so she could see the display. Your damping cycles are stacking. Donna studied the monitor only briefly before shaking her head. No, they're compensating dynamically. Too aggressively. That's impossible. Ray pointed toward the scrolling values. Look at the delay intervals. One of the younger engineers scoffed quietly. It's adaptive correction. Ray looked at him calmly. No, he said. It's feedback reinforcement. Donna folded her arms. The tower is designed to self-adjust during variable wind loads. And something changed. It passed inspection. Ray's voice remained steady. Inspection doesn't matter if somebody altered the response thresholds. That finally got her full attention, but not in the way he hoped. Now she looked offended. Are you accusing my team of negligence? I'm telling you the system's learning the wrong rhythm. Donna stepped closer, lowering her voice. Mr. Mercer, do you understand who designed this stabilization network? Yes. And you think a masonry worker discovered a catastrophic flaw during a gala? Ray didn't answer immediately, because the truthful answer sounded arrogant, and he hated arrogant men. Finally, he said quietly, I think the tower doesn't care about titles. The younger engineer rolled his eyes openly. Dana turned toward her team. Run a recalibration. Ray's head lifted instantly. No. Dana looked back at him. The compensation timing's already unstable, Ray warned. If you force synchronization now, you'll amplify rebound through the upper transfer frame. The younger engineer actually laughed this time. You hear yourself. Ray ignored him completely. Dana nodded toward the control panel. Begin recalibration. One engineer connected a diagnostic tablet into the stabilization port. Ray stepped forward immediately. Don't lock the dampers into automated phase matching. Dana's expression hardened. We are done taking structural advice from maintenance staff. The recalibration began. Across the monitor's cycle sequences shifted rapidly. For 1 second, everything looked stable. The numbers smoothed. The vibration softened. Donna gave Ray a look that almost resembled pity. Then the tower moved. Hard. The entire corridor lurched sideways just enough for overhead piping to rattle violently. One of the engineers grabbed the wall. A deep metallic groan echoed upward through the structure like distant thunder trapped inside steel. And suddenly every number on the monitor spiked red. Donna's confidence vanished instantly. What the hell? Another violent shudder rolled through the floor. Somewhere above them, glass cracked sharply. Not enough to fail. Enough to terrify. Emergency tones chirped briefly through the corridor speakers before cutting off halfway. Ray stared at the monitor. His jaw tightened. The recalibration had synchronized the tower directly into the wind frequency. Exactly what he warned them not to do. The building was no longer resisting motion. It was amplifying it. The system's echoing force back into itself, Ray said quietly. Donna rushed toward the panel. Kill the recalibration. One engineer hammered commands into the tablet. Nothing changed. The vibration intensified again. Overhead lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. A security supervisor burst into the corridor out of breath. There's movement on the observation levels, he said. Guests are panicking. Donna grabbed the radio immediately. Evacuate upper floors calmly. Before she could continue, another voice exploded through the radio. Elliot Vane. What is happening? Dana hesitated, and that hesitation alone told Ray everything. Because experts only paused like that when certainty had left the room. The radio crackled again. Donna, we're handling it. Ray looked upward toward the unseen upper floors where hundreds of people still stood beneath chandeliers and suspended glass. The building shifted again, longer this time, a rolling sway that traveled visibly through hanging utility lines. One of the engineers whispered, "Oh my God." Then the emergency monitor updated, wind speed increasing, structural oscillation increasing, automatic compensation unstable. Ray stepped toward the control panel slowly. You need to stop fighting the movement. Dana looked at him, actually looked at him now. No dismissal left. Only fear beginning to replace certainty. How, she asked quietly. Before Ray could answer, Elliot Vane stormed into the corridor, surrounded by security and executives. His face was pale with anger. What did you people do? Nobody answered immediately. Then Elliot's eyes landed on Ray, still standing there in his dusty work jacket, still calm. And somehow that calmness irritated him even more. "You," Elliot snapped. "Why are you even here?" Ray held his gaze. "Because your tower's about to teach itself how to collapse." And somewhere high above the gala floor, champagne glasses began sliding slowly across polished tables on their own. The first real panic started on the 89th floor, not because people saw danger, because they felt helpless before they understood it. A row of champagne glasses slid together across the central bar and shattered against polished marble, while the entire observation lounge swayed with a long, sickening motion that no luxury architect could explain away with elegant speeches. Music stopped mid-song. Guests grabbed tables instinctively. One woman screamed when a suspended lighting fixture began swinging overhead. Far below, through layers of steel and glass, Raymond Mercer felt the vibration hit the structure before the alarms finally followed. Too slow. The tower was reacting slower now, like a body losing coordination. Inside the west mechanical corridor, emergency warning lights flashed amber across the stabilization panels, while engineers shouted over overlapping radio traffic. Upper floors reporting lateral movement. Control systems aren't responding. Why are elevators pausing? Dana Halper hammered commands into the diagnostic console with growing desperation. Why aren't the dampers resyncing? Ray already knew, because the building no longer trusted its own instructions. The recalibration had poisoned the response cycle. Every automated correction now echoed force back into the structure instead of draining it away, like pushing someone who was already falling. Elliot Vane stood rigid near the corridor entrance, his expensive overcoat forgotten half open as executives crowded behind him with pale faces and phones pressed to their ears. "Fix it," Elliot snapped. Donna didn't answer. That frightened him more than the movement itself. Ray stepped closer to the control panel. "Stop sending override commands." Dana looked up sharply. "If we stop compensation, the oscillation spikes. If you keep forcing synchronization," Ray said calmly, "the tower will lock itself into harmonic rebound." One executive frowned. "What does that mean?" Ray looked toward the ceiling. "It means the building keeps repeating the same movement harder every cycle," as if to prove him right. The corridor shifted violently sideways again. One engineer slammed into a utility rack. Overhead pipes rattled like chains. A deep metallic groan rolled through the skyscraper from somewhere impossibly high above them. Not the sound of breaking. The sound before breaking. Elliot finally looked unsettled. "How bad is this?" Nobody answered immediately. Because honest answers change lawsuits into disasters. Ray spoke quietly. "The structure's still strong." Dana looked at him quickly, but she asked. Ray's eyes remained on the monitor, but the stabilization system's confused. One of the younger engineers shook his head nervously. "Systems don't get confused." Ray glanced at him once. "Yes," he said softly, "they do." Another violent sway hit the building, this time stronger. The emergency lights flickered red for half a second before stabilizing again. Across the monitor, floor movement readings climbed higher. 82nd floor, 85th, 90th. The upper sections were amplifying motion fastest. Then a new alarm appeared. Skybridge misalignment warning. Donna stared at it. "No." Elliot stepped forward immediately. "What is that?" Donna swallowed once before answering. "The internal observation bridge." "The glass bridge?" "Yes." The silence that followed felt colder than the winter outside. 300 feet above the ballroom, a suspended glass sky bridge connected two luxury observation lounges across an open vertical atrium. At full occupancy, dozens of guests could be standing on it. And if alignment shifted too far, the support bearings could jam under stress, trapping people inside. Or worse. A security officer burst into the corridor breathing hard. "We need guidance now," he said. "Guests are trying to leave all at once." "Use controlled evacuation," Dana ordered immediately. "Elevators." No elevators. At that exact moment, the lights dimmed briefly, then returned weaker. Somewhere above them, screaming echoed faintly through ventilation shafts. Elliot turned pale. Ray looked toward the structural monitor again. The oscillation peaks had changed shape, not random spikes anymore. Synchronization waves. The system was beginning to mirror external wind timing exactly. That was catastrophic, because skyscrapers survived storms by disrupting rhythm, not joining it. Ray reached toward the console carefully. Donna stopped him instantly. What are you doing? Reading raw structural response. We already have diagnostics. No, Ray said calmly. You have filtered diagnostics. That landed. Hard. Donna stared at him. Ray pointed toward the display curves. Those smoothing filters are hiding the real oscillation peaks. One engineer frowned. That can't be right. Ray pressed 2 commands into the console before anyone stopped him. The graph changed instantly, and the room froze. The smooth movement curves vanished. In their place, violent, jagged spikes hammered upward across the screen. Real movement. Real stress. Someone whispered, "Oh God." Dana stepped backward slowly, because now everyone could finally see what Ray had been warning them about from the beginning. The tower wasn't stabilizing. It was escalating. Elliot stared at the screen in disbelief. How did inspections miss this? Ray answered without emotion. Because the system was designed to look stable before it was designed to be honest. Silence. Then, every emergency speaker inside the corridor crackled simultaneously. Automated structural response mode activated. Several engineers exchanged confused looks immediately. Donna frowned. Why would it trigger autonomous mode? Ray's face darkened, because he understood before the others did. The building had crossed its own internal danger threshold. It no longer trusted manual corrections. The tower had begun protecting itself. And self-protection protocols in structures this large could become brutal. Automatic isolation, locked sections, sealed transit zones, restricted movement. The kind of measures designed to preserve structural integrity first and human comfort second. Suddenly, radios erupted across the corridor. Emergency stairwell C just sealed. We've got people trapped near the upper lounges. Observation bridge doors won't open. Dana grabbed her headset. Override them manually. A technician slammed commands into the console. Nothing happened. Again, nothing. Ray closed his eyes briefly. The building was rejecting external commands now, exactly like he feared. It thinks the overrides are destabilizing it, he said quietly. Elliot turned toward him sharply. You're telling me my skyscraper is refusing instructions? Ray met his eyes. I'm telling you, the system thinks you're making it worse. Another violent sway hit the tower. Far above them, glass exploded somewhere in the upper atrium. People screamed. Emergency strobes shifted from amber to flashing red, and for the first time all night. Elliot Vane looked genuinely afraid. Then Ray's phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. Sophie. Voicemail. He stared at the screen for half a second while alarms screamed around him, then pressed play. Her small voice filled the chaos softly. Hey, Dad. Recital's starting soon. Just checking if you're still coming. Behind her message, children laughed somewhere in the distance. Normal life. Warm life. Safe life. Ray looked up slowly at the trembling skyscraper surrounding hundreds of trapped people, then toward the structural monitor still climbing higher. And in that moment, he made a decision. Ray did not answer Sophie's voicemail. Not because he didn't want to. Because the building moved again before his thumb could reach the button. The entire west mechanical corridor tilted with a slow, unnatural sway, not enough to knock everyone down, but enough to make every person inside understand that 90 stories of glass and steel were no longer behaving like something permanent. A pipe bracket snapped overhead. It struck the floor with a sharp metallic crack. One of the younger engineers flinched backward and dropped his tablet. Dana Halper grabbed the edge of the console with both hands, her face drained of color as the structural monitor continued spiking red. Elliot Vane stared at the flashing warnings like a man watching his reputation turn into something much heavier than shame. Ray slipped the phone back into his jacket. Inside the same pocket, his fingers brushed the yellow scarf Sophie had knitted long ago when her hands were still thin from hospital treatments. For one brief second, he saw her sitting under fluorescent lights, concentrating fiercely on each uneven stitch because she had wanted to make something that could keep him warm. Then the radio screamed again. Control, we have guests trapped at the Skybridge entrance. Another voice cut in. Stairwell C is sealed from 84 through 90. Observation lounge doors aren't responding. People are pushing against the glass. Dana turned toward her team. Force manual override on the bridge doors. Ray stepped forward immediately. Don't. The word was quiet, but it carried. Donna looked at him shaken, but still clinging to the authority she had left. What? If you force those doors open while the bridge bearings are jammed, The system will think the span is losing lateral control. One engineer wiped sweat from his forehead. We don't have time for guesses. It's not a guess. Dana's eyes flickered toward Ray. For the first time, she wanted to believe him. But wanting was not enough. She had executives behind her emergency responders, calling hundreds of guests trapped above her. And a famous architect, watching every second like blame itself, had entered the corridor. Elliot stepped in sharply. Open the doors. Ray turned to him. If they open wrong, the bridge may lock under load. Elliot's face hardened. People are trapped. I know. Then stop standing there, talking like a philosopher, and help. Ray remained still. The safest path is to release the lower pressure braces first. Give the bridge room to settle. Then open the doors. Dana looked back to the screen. That would take too long. How long? 10 minutes if the system accepts the command. Ray's voice dropped. It won't. The younger engineer gave a bitter laugh. There it is again. The maintenance prophet. A few nervous smiles appeared from people desperate for anything that felt normal. Ray didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Elliot. Your tower is already rejecting commands. It reads as aggressive. If you force the doors without relieving stress, you'll turn a trapped crowd into a structural event. Elliot stepped closer. His polished shoes stopped inches from the dust on Ray's boots. You don't get to say things like that in front of my staff. Ray's expression did not change. I'm saying it because your staff needs to hear it. That sentence changed the air. The corridor seemed smaller suddenly. The alarms, the red strobes, the trembling steel, all of it pressed around the two men while everyone waited to see which one would bend. Elliot's pride chose for him. You are a bricklayer. He said each word sharp enough to cut. You lay stone. You patch walls. You clean up after real builders finish real work. Nobody laughed this time. But nobody stopped him either. That was worse. Ray lowered his gaze for half a second. Not in defeat. In control. Elliot continued louder now, driven by fear disguised as anger. This is a $500 million skyscraper designed by internationally recognized engineers. It is not a sidewalk repair project. It is not a basement wall. And it will not be managed by a man whose qualifications fit on the side of a cement bag. The younger engineer looked away. Dana's lips tightened. A security guard near the door shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Ray simply stood there, dust on his jacket, mortar scars on his hands. His daughter's yellow scarf tucked inside his pocket like a small hidden sun. Then Elliot pointed toward the exit. Get him out of here. For a moment, no one moved. The tower swayed again. Far above, another burst of screams echoed through the radio. Elliot snapped his head toward security. Now, two guards approached Ray carefully, as if they felt the wrongness of what they were doing, but had chosen obedience anyway. Luis appeared at the far end of the corridor, breathless from the service stairs. Wait, he said. Ray knows what he's talking about. Elliot turned on him. And who are you? Luis froze. A worker. Just another worker. That was enough. Elliot's face twisted with contempt. Perfect. A bricklayer and his assistant are now running emergency engineering. Ray raised one hand slightly to stop Luis from speaking. The gesture was calm, almost fatherly. Don't make it worse. Luis swallowed his anger. The guards reached Ray. He did not resist. He picked up his tool bag from the floor and turned toward the exit. As he moved, the side pocket caught on a broken metal bracket. The faded yellow scarf slipped free and fell onto the concrete. For one strangely quiet second, it lay there, under the red emergency light. Soft, handmade, small. A thing that did not belong among steel failures and billion-dollar panic. One of the executives glanced at it, then quickly looked away. The younger engineer smirked nervously, not because it was funny, but because cruelty sometimes arrived when people were afraid. Ray bent down and picked it up carefully. He brushed dust from the knitted edge with his thumb. The same thumb he had once used to wipe tears from Sophie's cheek in a hospital hallway after she asked if brave people were allowed to be scared. He had told her yes, especially brave people. Ray tucked the scarf back into his jacket pocket. Then he looked at Dana. Do not force the bridge doors. Donna said nothing. Her hand hovered above the console. Elliot's voice cut through. Run the override. Dana hesitated, only for a second. Then she gave the order. Manual bridge door override. Execute. The engineer entered the command. Ray stopped walking. The monitor flashed. Command accepted. Then the tower went still. too still. Every alarm seemed to pause for half a breath. Ray closed his eyes, because he knew. A deep mechanical boom erupted from somewhere above them. Not a crash, a lock, massive safety brakes clamping into place. Then the structural monitor exploded red. Sky bridge bearing lockout. Stairwell pressure imbalance. Upper transfer frame stress rising. The radio erupted into screams. The bridge doors opened 2 inches and froze. People are trapped between the lounge and the span. Stairwell lights just went red. Guests are falling. Somebody help us. Dana's hand froze above the keyboard. The younger engineer's mouth opened, but no words came. Elliot turned slowly toward Ray. For the first time, he did not look angry. He looked afraid of the man he had just humiliated. Ray stood between the 2 security guards, still holding his tool bag. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not move. He only looked up through the trembling bones of the skyscraper and listened to the building scream. The tower was no longer hiding its panic. From the street below, people stopped beneath the snowfall and stared upward as sections of the Vane Meridian Tower pulsed with intermittent red emergency lights behind the glass facade. News helicopters circled cautiously through the dark sky, while police barriers pushed crowds farther back from the entrance plaza. Inside the skyscraper, luxury disappeared fast. Fear stripped status away from people with frightening efficiency. On the 89th floor observation lounge, guests crouched beside overturned tables, while security officers tried to keep people away from the partially jammed skybridge entrance. The bridge itself groaned softly with every sway of the structure, its glass floors shifting by fractions of an inch that felt enormous to the trapped crowd. A woman held 2 terrified children against her chest near the locked stairwell. An older man in a tuxedo sat against the wall, breathing too fast. Someone nearby whispered prayers, and beneath all of it, the building kept moving, not wildly, rhythmically, like something enormous losing balance in slow motion. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. In the west mechanical corridor, nobody looked at Raymond Mercer the same way anymore. Not after the lockout, not after the warnings he gave had become reality, almost word for word. Dana Halper stood frozen before the structural console, while violent oscillation graphs hammered red across every monitor in the room. The younger engineer who laughed earlier now stared silently at the floor. Even Elliot Vane looked smaller somehow, not physically. Morally, the illusion surrounding him had cracked. He was still wealthy, still powerful, but fear had finally introduced him to limitation. Donna turned toward Ray slowly. What happens now? Ray stepped toward the monitors. No arrogance, no satisfaction, only focus. He studied the oscillation patterns for several long seconds while the corridor trembled faintly around them. Then he spoke. The tower's synchronizing lateral force faster than the damping system can bleed it off. One executive swallowed hard. In English, Ray pointed toward the monitor. The building keeps throwing its own weight back at itself. A deep metallic boom rolled somewhere high above them again. The entire corridor vibrated. Emergency dust drifted from ceiling joints. Ray's eyes lifted instantly. Upper transfer frame stress. Climbing. Another engineer approached nervously. Can the structure fail? Ray answered honestly, yes. Nobody spoke after that, because honesty sounded heavier than panic. Dana ran trembling fingers through her hair. We need a full evacuation. You won't get one. Why not? Ray pointed toward another flashing warning. Autonomous structural isolation active. The system's ceiling movement zones automatically. Elliot frowned. My building can do that? Ray looked at him once. It was designed to preserve structural integrity during catastrophic resonance. The words hit Elliot strangely. Designed, not theoretical, not experimental. Designed. As if somewhere beneath all this chaos existed intentions nobody in the room fully understood. Dana stepped closer to the monitor again. What triggers full isolation? Ray's answer came too quickly. Load transfer shear risk. The younger engineer looked confused. Meaning, if the building thinks certain sections are destabilizing the whole structure, Ray said quietly, it sacrifices movement access to protect the core frame. Silence. Then realization spread slowly across the room. Stairwells locking, doors freezing, sections isolating. The tower wasn't malfunctioning randomly. It was protecting itself. And human beings had become secondary variables. A terrified voice exploded through the radio. We have children trapped near the north observation corridor. Ray's head snapped toward the speaker. Children, fundraiser guests. Some schools were invited for the gala presentation. Another voice cut in. We can't get the corridor doors open. For the first time all night, something sharp crossed Ray's face. Not anger, urgency. Because suddenly the building no longer felt abstract. It felt personal. He saw Sophie for half a heartbeat standing backstage at her recital in that yellow scarf, waiting for him to arrive. Waiting the way children waited for promises. Ray reached into his jacket pocket unconsciously and touched the scarf again. Soft fabric beneath rough hands. A reminder. People first. Always. Donna noticed the movement. For a brief second, she saw not a maintenance worker, not a problem, a father. Ray looked back at the structural data. Then at the emergency stairwell schematics displayed beside the monitor, and suddenly his expression changed. He understood something. The system thinks the override commands are attacks, he said quietly. Donna blinked. What? The recalibration loop. Ray pointed toward the command logs. Every forced synchronization attempt looked unstable to the autonomous response network. One engineer frowned. So it locked us out. No, Ray said. His eyes lifted slowly toward the ceiling. It locked everyone out. Another violent sway rolled through the skyscraper. Somewhere overhead, glass shattered. The corridor lights flickered again. Then half the monitors went dark. One executive cursed under his breath. Emergency backup systems kicked in seconds later, bathing the corridor in harsh red illumination that made every face look exhausted and frightened. Donna turned toward Ray fully now. What do we do? Not sarcastic anymore. Not defensive. Real. Ray studied the schematics carefully. There's still one way to calm the oscillation. Elliot stepped closer immediately. Then do it. Ray ignored the tone. The damping system needs manual load redistribution from below the crown frame. Donna's eyes widened. That chamber's restricted and isolated now. One engineer shook his head nervously. Nobody can reach it during active resonance. Ray looked toward the service access map. Yes, he said quietly. Somebody can. Elliot stared at him. You! Ray nodded once. Before anyone could answer, the radio screamed again. We have movement on the bridge. Panic flooded the background. People crying. Metal groaning. A security officer shouting for everyone to stay back. Then another voice. The bridge bearings are locking harder. Ray stepped toward the equipment locker immediately and grabbed a heavy utility flashlight along with a harness pack hanging nearby. Dana watched him. You already know where you're going. Ray secured the flashlight to his belt calmly. I know where the old maintenance tunnels connect beneath the stabilization core. The younger engineer frowned. How would you know that? Ray didn't answer. Not yet. Elliot moved in front of him suddenly. You're saying you can fix this? Ray met his eyes. No. That answer startled everyone. Then he continued. I'm saying I might be able to stop it from getting worse. No hero speech. No confidence performance. Just truth. And somehow, the honesty frightened them more than certainty would have. Donna grabbed his arm before he turned away. If you're wrong. The tower tears itself apart floor by floor, Ray said calmly. Nobody moved after that. The words settled over the corridor like ash. Then Ray looked toward the emergency access schematics one final time. The building shifted again. Longer now. More unstable. A nearby monitor cracked across the corner from vibration stress. Far above them, hundreds of trapped people waited inside a skyscraper, slowly fighting itself. And Raymond Mercer, the man mocked for laying bricks, started walking toward the heart of the tower. The deeper Raymond Mercer moved into the tower, the quieter the panic became, not because the danger faded, because the building swallowed sound. Beyond the luxury floors and investor ballrooms existed another version of the skyscraper. Few guests would ever see a hidden skeleton of concrete access shafts, steel maintenance tunnels, pressure control chambers, and narrow service bridges running through the core like arteries inside a giant mechanical body. Emergency lights pulsed dim red across the walls as Ray descended a restricted maintenance stairwell beneath the west stabilization systems. Above him, the tower groaned. Below him, old structural pipes vibrated softly with every oscillation cycle. The building was still fighting itself, but now he was close enough to hear where. Luis caught up to him halfway down the stairwell, carrying a portable diagnostic case. You shouldn't be alone, he said breathlessly. Ray looked back once. You should be upstairs evacuating. Luis shook his head immediately. They need people who know these tunnels. A faint smile almost appeared on Ray's face. Almost. Then another violent sway rolled through the tower. The stairwell lights flickered. Luis grabbed the rail instinctively. Ray didn't. He simply paused and listened, counting silently. 1, 2, 3. The vibration repeated again through the lower support frame. 2 even. Too mechanical. Ray's expression darkened. They locked the dampers into mirrored compensation, he muttered. Luis frowned. What does that mean? Ray resumed walking downward. It means the tower's correcting movement at the exact wrong moment. Another groan echoed through the stairwell. Steel under stress. Not failing yet. Warning. Luis glanced upward nervously. Can this place actually come down? Ray answered honestly. Not all at once. Luis looked even more terrified somehow. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Back in the west mechanical corridor, Elliot Vane watched emergency responders flood into the building through security feeds, while reporters gathered outside behind police barricades. Every screen showed movement, chaos, fear, and every few minutes, another red structural warning flashed across the monitors. Donna Halper stood beside the control console, reviewing updated stress readings with trembling concentration. One of the engineers looked toward Elliot carefully. We should prepare for partial structural sacrifice. Elliot stared at him. What? The engineer swallowed. If oscillation transfer exceeds frame tolerance, the autonomous system may intentionally isolate upper sections to preserve core integrity. The words sounded clinical, but everyone understood the meaning. Trap part of the building to save the rest. Elliot ran both hands through his hair. No, Donna didn't answer, because she knew the engineer was right. Then one of the emergency responders approached quickly. Who's Mercer? The room shifted slightly. Dana pointed toward the service stairwell feed. Why? The responder held up a tablet. Because your maintenance worker just rerouted pressure balance through 2 lower support sectors manually. Everyone stared at him. What Dana asked. The responder turned the tablet toward them. Structural movement readings on several lower floors had dropped slightly. Not enough to solve the problem. Enough to matter. Elliot frowned. How? The responder shook his head. No idea. But whoever he is, he understands this building better than your consultants do. Nobody spoke after that. Dana lowered her eyes slowly toward the monitor, and for the first time all night, she wondered who Raymond Mercer really was. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 3 levels beneath the primary stabilization core, Ray reached a locked maintenance gate, hidden behind old utility conduits and emergency pipe routing. Unlike the polished upper systems, this section of the tower looked older, practical, unfinished. The kind of infrastructure architects rarely photographed. Ray knelt beside the access panel immediately. Luis watched nervously. You've been here before. It wasn't really a question. Ray didn't answer directly. Help me remove the lower housing. Luis crouched beside him while the tower shifted again overhead. Metal dust drifted softly from the ceiling. Together, they pulled away the access panel, exposing a cluster of analog relay systems buried beneath modern digital controls. Luis blinked in confusion. I thought this place was fully automated. It was supposed to be. Ray ran his flashlight across the relay housings carefully. Then his jaw tightened. Several components had been replaced. Cheaply, not original hardware. Luis noticed his expression immediately. What? Ray pointed toward the vibration isolation mounts. These aren't the correct dampening pads. Luis frowned. How can you tell? Because the originals were military-grade composite. Silence. Luis looked at him slowly. How do you know what the originals were? Ray ignored the question. He pressed one rough hand against the exposed relay frame and closed his eyes briefly. Feeling vibration travel through the system, the pattern confirmed his fear instantly. The replacement pads were rebounding energy too aggressively during high wind oscillation. The stabilization system thought the tower weighed less than it actually did. Every correction cycle was slightly late, and in skyscrapers, slightly late became deadly very fast. Luis stared at the exposed hardware. Somebody replaced these, probably during budget revisions. Wouldn't engineers notice? Ray gave a quiet answer. Not if the diagnostics were filtered. Another violent sway rolled through the maintenance tunnel. This one strong enough to trigger emergency crack sounds somewhere deep in the surrounding concrete. Luis went pale. Ray remained focused. He opened the diagnostic case and began reconnecting several manual balancing relays, bypassing the digital stabilization network entirely. Luis watched carefully. "You move like you've done this before." Ray tightened a connection point. "A long time ago." "That doesn't answer the question." Ray finally looked at him. In the harsh red emergency light, his face looked older suddenly, more tired. "I used to work on structures where failure killed people fast." Luis stared. "What kind of structures?" Before Ray could answer, the emergency radio burst alive on Luis's belt. "Control to all response teams. We have increasing displacement on the upper observation bridge." Another voice shouted over the transmission. "Structural frame stress rising near crown support sectors." Ray stood instantly. The crown frame. The oscillation had reached the upper transfer spine faster than he expected. Bad. Very bad, because once the force reached the crown incorrectly, the entire tower could begin reflecting movement downward through the main frame, like shaking the top of a tree until the trunk cracked. Luis grabbed the rail as the building shifted again. Ray looked upward through layers of steel and concrete, as if he could see the trapped people above him, then toward the narrow maintenance tunnel extending deeper beneath the tower. There was only one place left to stop the synchronization cycle completely. The original stabilization chamber beneath the crown frame, restricted, isolated, and according to official tower schematics, impossible to access during autonomous lockout. But Ray knew something the others didn't. A hidden maintenance route still existed, because years ago, before the tower became Elliot Vane's masterpiece, someone had insisted on building one, and that someone had been Raymond Mercer. The tower began shedding its illusion of control floor by floor. On the 83rd level, decorative ceiling panels cracked loose and crashed across a luxury dining area moments after security evacuated the room. On the 87th floor, emergency doors froze halfway open, while frightened guests squeezed through narrow gaps before the system sealed again. Above the observation bridge, hidden deep inside the crown structure, steel transfer joints screamed under mounting stress every time the wind pushed against the skyscraper from the lakefront. And across every emergency channel inside the building, one name had begun spreading quietly between frightened responders. Mercer, not the bricklayer, not maintenance, just Mercer. Like the building itself had already decided who understood it. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Inside the West Control Corridor, Dana Halper stared at updated structural reports with growing disbelief. "Lower oscillation sectors are stabilizing," one engineer whispered. Another checked the live displacement readings again. "He's manually redistributing load pathways," Howe Elliott demanded. Nobody answered, because none of them understood how a man they mocked an hour earlier was outperforming an entire engineering response team armed with advanced diagnostics. Dana looked toward the service tunnel feed on the monitor wall. The camera showed Raymond Mercer and Luis moving through a narrow maintenance corridor, lit only by emergency strobes and handheld flashlights. Every few seconds, the tower trembled violently around them, and still Ray walked calmly, like fear no longer had enough time to matter. A firefighter near the control station removed his helmet slowly while watching the feed. "That guy military." Dana shook her head faintly. "I don't think so." But uncertainty lingered in her voice, because the truth was becoming harder to ignore. People did not move through catastrophic structural failure that way unless they had seen it before. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Far above them, the observation bridge groaned again. A terrified group of guests huddled against the lounge wall, while emergency responders fought to keep people calm. The bridge doors remained jammed, partially open, their locking mechanisms twisted under uneven pressure loads. A little girl near the back of the crowd clutched a stuffed rabbit while crying into her mother's shoulder. One security officer whispered into his radio, "Please tell me somebody's fixing this." The answer came from below. "Mercer's working on it." And somehow, that calmed people, not because they knew who Ray was, because desperate people recognize certainty when they heard it. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 3 levels beneath the crown frame, Ray reached another secured maintenance junction hidden behind old utility routing panels. Unlike the sleek, modern systems elsewhere in the skyscraper, this chamber carried signs of older engineering philosophy. Manual override levers, analog balancing gauges, mechanical redundancy systems, built for human hands. Luis stared around the chamber nervously. "This place isn't on the maintenance maps." "No," Ray said quietly, It wouldn't be. The building shifted again, hard enough this time to knock dust loose from overhead concrete seams. Luis grabbed a railing. Ray stepped directly toward the balancing console mounted beside the structural relay housing. Most of the digital systems connected to it were dead now, but several old manual controls still functioned. That was enough. Ray opened the emergency panel carefully. Inside, rows of balancing relays stretched downward beneath faded engineering labels written years earlier. His eyes moved across them quickly, then stopped. Something was missing. His expression changed immediately. Luis noticed. What? Ray pointed toward an empty mounting bracket. The secondary transfer isolator. Luis frowned. What does it do? It absorbs delayed rebound force from the crown frame, and it's gone. Ray nodded once. Removed. Luis stared at the empty bracket. Why would anyone remove something like that? Ray gave a bitter answer. Because safety systems don't impress investors if nobody understands them. The tower lurched again. Somewhere above them, steel boomed under stress. Luis swallowed hard. Can we still stop this? Ray looked toward the manual balancing controls. Yes. Luis exhaled in relief. Then Ray continued, but not automatically. That relief vanished immediately. Ray grabbed a heavy manual relay lever and locked it downward. The entire chamber vibrated sharply in response. Across the emergency monitor attached to Luis's portable kit, several oscillation readings finally began dropping. Not dramatically. Enough. Ray moved to the second relay, then the third. Every adjustment redirected force through alternate structural pathways the automated system no longer recognized. Old methods, manual methods. The kind modern luxury towers abandoned because computers were cleaner than human judgment. Above them, emergency radio traffic shifted tone slightly. Less screaming, more coordination. One trapped stairwell reopened. Then another. Emergency responders began evacuating groups downward through stabilized sections. Luis stared at the monitor. You're actually calming it. Ray didn't answer. He was listening again. Because despite the improving readings, something deeper still felt wrong. Then he saw it. A delayed spike traveling upward through the crown transfer sectors. His face hardened instantly. The upper frame still feeding rebound. Luis looked at the monitor nervously. What does that mean? It means the core damping chamber never accepted isolation mode. Another violent sway hit the tower, harder than before. The emergency lights flickered out completely for 2 terrifying seconds before backup power returned. Somewhere in the darkness above them, glass exploded. Luis flinched. Ray remained focused. Then the radio screamed alive. We have structural stress alarms on the crown support sectors. Another voice shouted over panic. Observation bridge displacement increasing again. Ray closed his eyes briefly. The lower adjustments were buying time. Nothing more. If the crown damping chamber stayed synchronized incorrectly, the entire oscillation cycle would rebuild itself. Bigger, more violent, potentially irreversible. Luis looked at him carefully. What now? Ray turned toward a narrow maintenance ladder disappearing upward through the concrete core. Hidden, unmarked, forgotten. The original stabilization chamber. Luis stared upward. That goes all the way to the crown. Ray nodded. I thought those access routes were removed. They were supposed to be. Another sway rolled through the chamber. This one long enough to make the manual gauges tremble violently. Ray secured his harness calmly. Luis watched him. Then finally asked the question that had been growing inside him for the last hour. Who are you, really? For a moment, Ray said nothing. Only the groaning skyscraper answered. Then quietly, without pride, he spoke. Years ago, after a tower failure in Seattle. His eyes stayed on the ladder. I helped design emergency resonance survival systems for structures that couldn't afford a second mistake. Luis stared at him. You designed systems like this. Ray tightened the harness straps. I designed systems people hoped they'd never need. Above them, another violent metallic boom shook the entire chamber. The crown frame was getting worse. Fast, Ray grabbed the flashlight from his belt, then started climbing toward the heart of the skyscraper, while hundreds of lives hung inside the movement of steel around him. And far below, inside the control corridor, Elliot Vane watched the live stabilization readings improve for the first time all night. One of the engineers whispered softly without taking his eyes off the screen. The bricklayer is saving the tower. Nobody laughed this time. The ladder to the crown stabilization chamber climbed through the center of the skyscraper like a spine inside a dying animal. Raymond Mercer moved upward slowly, one gloved hand at a time, while the tower trembled around him in long waves of steel fatigue and trapped force. Emergency lights flickered red through the narrow shaft, turning the concrete walls into something that felt less like architecture and more like the inside of a wound. Below him, Luis followed carefully with the portable diagnostics case strapped across his back. Neither man spoke much. Breathing mattered more now. Listening mattered more. Every few seconds, Ray paused against the ladder and closed his eyes, briefly feeling the vibration cycles traveling through the frame. The oscillation was worsening near the crown. Too much delayed rebound. The upper structure was beginning to reflect movement downward through the main spine again, like a bell refusing to stop ringing. Above them, another deep, metallic groan rolled through the shaft. Luis froze instantly. Was that the frame? Yes. That sounded bad. Ray resumed climbing. It was. No comfort. No lies. Only truth. That frightened Luis more than panic ever could. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Back inside the West Control Corridor, the atmosphere had changed completely. Nobody spoke to Elliot Vane with admiration anymore. Now they spoke in clipped emergency tones, while staring at monitors filled with structural warnings and evacuation data. The illusion of prestige had been stripped away by physics. Donna Halper stood near the central console reviewing live stabilization feeds, while emergency responders coordinated partial evacuations floor by floor. And on every screen, Ray Mercer, climbing, working, saving time the experts had already lost. One emergency structural analyst frowned at the monitor. Who the hell trained this guy? Donna didn't answer immediately, because she was staring at something else. A small authorization marker flashing intermittently across the lower maintenance schematics. Mercer on our legacy access route verified. Her eyes narrowed. Wait. She moved closer to the screen. One of the engineers looked over. What is it? Donna typed quickly through archived infrastructure permissions buried deep inside the tower's engineering records. Most access logs had been updated during construction ownership changes, but some older files remained locked behind inactive permissions, and one name kept appearing. Mercer. Her heartbeat quickened slightly. No. She opened another file, then another, and suddenly the room around her seemed to disappear. Years-old engineering revisions filled the screen. Emergency resonance isolation proposals, manual load transfer failsafe concepts, structural survival routing for catastrophic oscillation scenarios, all authored under one restricted consulting signature, R. Mercer. The younger engineer blinked. That can't be him. Donna kept scrolling. Then she found the archived simulation footage, a grainy training recording from nearly 12 years earlier. The video opened automatically. A younger Raymond Mercer stood inside a structural response laboratory, wearing a dark engineering jacket instead of construction gear. Behind him, massive tower resonance models rotated across digital screens, while elite emergency analysts took notes around him. Even younger, his face carried the same stillness, the same restraint, the same calm certainty. In the recording, Ray spoke quietly to the room. Buildings don't fail because they move. They fail because systems begin lying about movement. The control corridor went silent. One engineer slowly lowered his tablet. Another stopped typing completely. Dana stared at the screen like someone realizing they had insulted a surgeon while bleeding on the operating table. Elliot stepped closer. What is this? Dana looked at him carefully. This tower's emergency resonance system. She swallowed once. He helped design it. The words seemed impossible even after they were spoken. Elliot stared at the frozen image of younger Ray on the monitor. The man he mocked. The man security escorted out. The man currently climbing through a dying skyscraper, trying to save everyone inside it. One firefighter removed his gloves slowly while watching the screen. Jesus Christ, another engineer whispered. He wasn't maintenance. Donna finally shook her head faintly. No, she said quietly. He just never bothered correcting us. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 92 floors above the city, Ray finally reached the crown stabilization chamber. The door remained sealed behind emergency lock protocols, but unlike the others trapped by the automated system, Ray knew exactly where the hidden manual release panel had been installed, because he had argued for it personally years ago. He pulled away a narrow side plate beside the frame and reached inside the emergency override cavity. Luis stared. "You designed a hidden release." Ray focused on the mechanism. "I designed a backup for the day computers stopped trusting people." A loud crack echoed somewhere overhead. The tower swayed violently. Luis grabbed the wall. Ray turned the manual release wheel slowly. Heavy internal locks disengaged one by one with deep metallic thunks. Then the chamber door opened. Inside, the heart of the skyscraper waited. The stabilization chamber stretched across the multiple levels beneath the crown frame, filled with massive suspended damping assemblies, pressure regulators, analog relay systems, and enormous steel balancing arms moving in controlled opposition against the tower's sway. Or at least, they were supposed to. Now the entire chamber looked wrong. One of the balancing assemblies had locked several degrees off alignment. Hydraulic compensators pulsed unevenly. Stress alarms flashed crimson across emergency panels. And at the center of it all, the primary resonance core continued forcing the tower into synchronized rebound. Luis stared in horror. "It looks like it's fighting itself." Ray nodded once. "Because it is." He stepped toward the main control housing carefully, then stopped. Mounted beside the emergency relay console sat a faded metal identification plate almost hidden beneath years of maintenance dust. "Authorized Resonance Failsafe Consultant R. Mercer." Luis looked from the plate to Ray slowly. "You built this?" Ray's expression remained distant. "No," he said quietly. "I built the part that was supposed to stop this." Another violent oscillation rolled through the chamber. One of the upper balancing arms slammed sideways, hard enough to spray hydraulic fluid across the floor. Warning sirens erupted instantly. The crown frame was running out of tolerance. Fast. Far below them, emergency responders continued evacuating trapped guests, while the city watched the swaying skyscraper through falling snow and helicopter lights. And inside the crown chamber, Raymond Mercer stepped toward the failing heart of the tower he once helped save before it even existed. The crown stabilization chamber sounded like a storm trapped inside metal. Hydraulic arms slammed against resistance pistons with violent mechanical force, while warning sirens pulsed through the chamber in overlapping waves of red light and distorted alarms. Massive balancing assemblies suspended near the ceiling swayed several feet off proper alignment, dragging delayed force through the tower's upper frame every time the wind struck from the lake. The skyscraper was still standing, but it was no longer stable. It was surviving moment to moment. Raymond Mercer stepped carefully across the trembling chamber floor toward the central resonance console, while hydraulic fluid dripped steadily from damaged pressure lines overhead. Luis followed several feet behind him, carrying the diagnostics case with both hands. "You designed this place?" he asked again quietly. Ray shook his head faintly. "I designed the emergency survival logic." Another violent oscillation rolled through the chamber. One of the balancing arms shrieked under pressure. Luis stared upward nervously. "That doesn't sound survivable." Ray's eyes moved across the failing system. "It isn't. Not much longer." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Far below them, the evacuation had finally become organized. Not calm. Never calm, but organized. Emergency crews guided frightened guests downward through newly reopened stairwells, while firefighters moved floor by floor, checking for trapped occupants. The observation bridge remained partially jammed, but the stabilization improvements Ray initiated earlier had reduced enough structural stress to prevent total bearing lock. People were getting out, slowly, because one man everyone dismissed had refused to stop helping them. Inside the West Control Corridor, nobody sat anymore. Nobody joked. Nobody checked phones. Every monitor showed live evacuation feeds, structural displacement graphs, and the crown chamber camera Luis had manually reactivated minutes earlier. On-screen Ray moved through the chamber with terrifying calm while the skyscraper shook around him. The silence inside the control corridor had changed shape now. Not empty silence, heavy silence. The kind built from shame. One investor who had laughed earlier during Elliot Vane's humiliation of Ray now stood near the back wall staring at the floor, with both hands wrapped tightly around a cold, untouched coffee cup. A firefighter removed his helmet slowly, without taking his eyes off the screen. Donna Halper stood completely still beside the console, and Elliot, the architect whose name covered the entire tower, could no longer look directly at the monitor for very long. Because every second Ray remained inside that chamber made the truth harder to escape. The man they mocked understood the building better than the people who claimed ownership over it. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Inside the crown chamber, Ray reached the central resonance core. The display panel flashed structural warnings faster than the system could voice them. Crown frame stress rising. Damper synchronization failure. Load transfer imbalance. Manual override recommended. Ray stared at the final warning several seconds, then quietly said, "At least you still know when you need help." Luis looked confused. "What?" Ray didn't answer. He opened the primary relay housing instead. Inside sat rows of emergency balancing controls hidden beneath locked service covers, old manual systems most modern engineers considered obsolete. But Ray trusted old systems. Old systems told the truth. Computers optimized. Humans survived. He reached for the first balancing lever. The entire tower shifted violently again. Luis nearly lost his footing. But Ray locked the lever downward anyway. Deep inside the chamber, enormous steel counterweights groaned into motion. The effect was immediate. Across the diagnostic monitor, upper oscillation peaks dropped slightly. Not enough, but enough to matter. Far below them, several evacuation corridors stabilized long enough for trapped groups to move again. Inside the West Control Corridor, one engineer leaned forward suddenly. Movement reduction on 86 through 92. Another checked the readings twice. It's working. Nobody celebrated. Because the tower still shook, still screamed, still threatened to tear itself apart above the city. Ray moved to the second relay, then the third. Every adjustment redirected force manually through alternative load pathways the automated system no longer trusted. Sweat rolled slowly down Luis's face, despite the freezing chamber air. How do you even know what to change? Ray tightened another relay sequence carefully. Buildings talk. Luis blinked. What? They tell you where they're hurting. Another violent metallic boom shook the chamber hard enough to trigger fresh stress alarms. This one sounded different. Sharper. Ray's expression changed instantly. He looked upward toward the crown support frame. The final pressure sector. Still unstable. Still feeding delayed force back into the tower. The dangerous part wasn't the movement anymore. It was timing. The building was correcting itself a fraction too late every cycle. And that tiny delay was multiplying across millions of pounds of steel. Luis stared at the monitor. What happens if it keeps climbing? Ray answered quietly. The crown frame fractures first. Luis swallowed hard. And then, Ray didn't answer immediately, because some truth became cruel when spoken aloud. Finally, then gravity finishes the conversation. The chamber fell silent except for the screaming machinery. Then Ray saw it. A manual balancing route hidden beneath the emergency relay matrix. Disabled, years old, ignored by the updated digital systems. His eyes narrowed. This is it. Luis stepped closer. What? The original transfer bypass. Another violent sway hit the tower. Overhead warning lights exploded in sparks. Ray grabbed the final override wheel with both hands. Luis looked at him nervously. What does it do? Ray's voice stayed calm. It forces the crown frame to stop listening to the damaged synchronization cycle. Luis frowned. And if it fails? Ray looked once toward the shaking ceiling. Then the upper structure snaps the force back downward. Luis went pale. You mean the whole tower? I know what it means. Silence. Then, unexpectedly, Ray reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out Sophie's faded yellow scarf. For a second, Luis looked confused. Ray wrapped the scarf once around his bleeding palm where the relay housing had sliced his skin earlier. Not dramatically, practically. Then, he tightened his grip on the override wheel. Luis stared at the scarf, a child's scarf, inside a failing skyscraper. And somehow, that image felt heavier than all the alarms around them. Because suddenly this wasn't about engineering anymore. It was about a father trying to make sure other children still got to go home tonight. Far below, inside the control corridor, the live camera zoomed slightly as Ray gripped the override wheel. The room watching him became perfectly still. A reporter slowly lowered her phone. One engineer's hand froze above the keyboard without typing. The investor holding the coffee cup set it down carefully because his fingers had started trembling. Dana Halper removed her headset one side at a time, and Elliot Vane, the man who publicly called Ray just a bricklayer, stood motionless before the monitor while the reflection of Raymond Mercer's name glowed faintly across the glass beside his face. No one spoke, because shame had finally become heavier than pride. Then Ray began turning the override wheel, and the skyscraper screamed. The override wheel fought Raymond Mercer like it wanted to stay buried in the past. Every inch of movement dragged through locked mechanical resistance, while the crown stabilization chamber convulsed around him in waves of violent vibration. The enormous balancing assemblies overhead screamed under pressure as the tower twisted against winter wind high above Chicago. Ray kept turning, slowly, steadily. The yellow scarf wrapped around his bleeding hand darkened where hydraulic oil and blood soaked into the knitted fabric. Luis braced himself against the relay housing nearby, while emergency warnings exploded across the monitors. Crown frame pressure critical. Transfer load instability rising. Manual override active. Then the skyscraper lurched sideways hard enough to throw Luis to one knee. A balancing arm slammed against its restraint assembly with a deafening metallic impact. The entire chamber shook. Ray never let go. Ray, Luis shouted. The frame's overloading. I know. No panic. No shouting. Only focus. Because panic wasted oxygen, and Ray needed every second. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Far below them, evacuation crews finally began clearing the upper observation levels. Guests moved through reopened stairwells wrapped in emergency blankets, while firefighters guided exhausted people downward, floor by floor. Several injured guests sat near temporary triage stations inside the lower lobby, staring silently at the swaying glass walls as if they still could not fully believe the skyscraper remained standing. Outside, snow continued falling across police barricades and flashing emergency lights. News helicopters hovered above the skyline, broadcasting live footage of the trembling tower to millions of viewers across the country. And inside the West Control Corridor, nobody looked away from the monitor anymore. The silence there had become something sacred. One engineer wiped tears from his face without noticing. The investor who mocked Ray earlier now sat with both elbows on his knees, staring at the floor in complete shame. Dana Halper stood motionless beside the control station with her headset hanging uselessly around her neck. And Elliot Vane, the architect whose name crowned the building, watched Raymond Mercer fight to save the tower with the expression of a man realizing money could not buy dignity after all. Another violent tremor rolled through the skyscraper. The monitor feed distorted briefly, then stabilized again. On screen, Ray pulled harder against the override wheel while warning lights flashed around him like artillery fire. A firefighter near the back whispered softly, "He's doing this by hand." Nobody answered, because the truth sounded too heavy spoken aloud. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Inside the crown chamber, the override mechanism finally shifted another inch. Deep inside the tower, enormous transfer locks disengaged one by one with thunderous metallic booms. The effect hit instantly. Across the structural monitors, oscillation timing changed. Not stable yet, but different. The tower's movements began falling slightly out of synchronization with the wind. Exactly what Ray needed. Luis stared at the readings. "It's working." Ray shook his head once. Not enough. Another crack echoed overhead. This one, sharper than the others. Luis looked upward in terror. The crown support sectors were reaching tolerance limits. Ray saw it too. The upper frame was still carrying too much delayed force. If the rebound timing didn't fully break within minutes, the structural stress would cascade downward through the transfer spine again. And next time the tower might not recover. Ray released the override wheel carefully and moved toward the manual balancing controls. Luis looked confused. "What are you doing?" "Finishing it." The answer chilled him, because Ray sounded less like a man improvising, and more like a man walking through procedures he already knew by memory. Ray studied the balancing gauges several seconds. Then his eyes narrowed. One of the old analog pressure sectors remained frozen slightly off alignment. A damaged hydraulic transfer valve, still feeding force back into the upper frame. And the only way to reset it was manually, at the valve itself. Luis followed his gaze upward toward a narrow, exposed maintenance beam, suspended high across the chamber, beside the unstable balancing assembly. "No," he whispered immediately. Ray was already securing another harness line. The tower shifted violently again. A burst hydraulic line sprayed fluid across the chamber floor. Emergency alarms screamed louder. Luis stepped in front of him. "You can't go up there." Ray adjusted the harness calmly. "I can." The whole frame's unstable. Yes, you could fall. Ray looked at him quietly. So could everybody else. That ended the argument. For a moment, Luis just stared at him helplessly. Then finally asked the question nobody else had thought to ask all night. Why'd you leave? Ray paused. The chamber groaned around them. Far below, thousands of people watched the skyscraper shake against the winter skyline. And inside all that chaos, Ray answered simply, Sophie got sick. Luis blinked. The hospital treatment started while I was consulting on 3 towers at once. Ray clipped the safety line into place. One day I realized I knew more about emergency structures than my own daughter. His voice never cracked. That somehow made it hurt more. So I walked away. Luis stared at him. You gave all this up. Ray looked upward toward the unstable balancing assembly. I gave up applause. Then he started climbing. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Back in the control corridor, Dana suddenly leaned toward the monitor. What is he doing? One engineer checked the structural feed. There's still a locked transfer valve in the upper balancing arm. Elliot frowned. Can't it be reset remotely? No, Dana whispered. The realization hit her visibly. It has to be done manually. Silence spread again. On screen, Ray climbed across the narrow maintenance beam high above the chamber floor, while the skyscraper trembled beneath him. One wrong movement, one mistimed oscillation, and he would fall into the mechanical core below. A security guard slowly removed his cap. Another engineer looked away because he could not bear watching. Elliot stepped closer to the screen unconsciously. His reflection merged faintly with Ray's image in the glass. The arrogant architect, the bricklayer he humiliated. One safe on the ground, one hanging above disaster. And suddenly Elliot understood something unbearable. Raymond Mercer never once tried to embarrass him back. Not after the insults, not after the laughter, not even after being proven right. He simply kept trying to save people. The realization hollowed something inside him. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. High above the chamber floor, Ray finally reached the damaged hydraulic transfer valve. The balancing assembly thundered overhead like a moving train made of steel and pressure. His safety line strained violently every few seconds as the tower swayed. Below him, Luis shouted, Ray. The oscillation cycle was building again. Fast. Ray wrapped the yellow scarf tighter around his injured hand, then reached toward the frozen valve release. The metal burned cold beneath his fingers. Another violent sway hit the tower. The balancing arm screamed overhead, and Raymond Mercer pulled the release lever manually, just as the skyscraper reached the edge of catastrophic rebound. The moment Raymond Mercer pulled the release lever, the entire crown chamber exploded with sound, not destruction. Correction. Deep beneath the skyscraper's skin, massive balancing systems shifted violently into new alignment as delayed force finally broke apart across the transfer frame. Hydraulic locks slammed open one after another in thunderous sequence, while enormous counterweights adjusted against the wind with terrifying mechanical force. The tower lurched, once, hard enough to make every person inside freeze. Then, for the first time all night, the movement began slowing, not stopping completely, just softening, like a body finally remembering how to breathe. High above the chamber floor, Ray held onto the maintenance beam, while the balancing assembly screamed overhead one final time before settling into smoother motion. Below him, Luis stared at the structural monitor in disbelief. Ray. The oscillation readings were falling, steadily, floor by floor, sector by sector. The dangerous synchronization pattern was collapsing. The skyscraper was surviving. Far beneath them, emergency responders felt it immediately. The stairwells stopped jerking sideways. The observation bridge stabilized enough for trapped guests to cross safely under firefighter supervision. Elevator shafts stopped groaning under uneven stress. And across the city skyline, the Vane Meridian Tower finally looked less like a dying machine and more like a building again. Inside the West Control Corridor, nobody spoke, not even when the structural alarms began clearing one by one across the monitors. Oscillation warning reduced, transfer load stabilizing, crown frame pressure falling. An engineer slowly lowered his hands from the keyboard. A firefighter exhaled shakily and sat down against the wall. One investor quietly covered his mouth with both hands. And Elliot Vane, the architect who built his career on commanding rooms, stood speechless while Raymond Mercer climbed down from the crown beam on screen with blood on his hands and hydraulic fluid across his jacket. The silence inside the corridor felt heavier than applause ever could. Dana Halper removed her glasses slowly. "They're alive," she whispered. Nobody answered, because suddenly survival itself felt sacred. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. By 11:43 p.m., the last trapped guests were finally escorted safely out of the upper observation sectors. Emergency crews continued inspecting structural zones, while helicopters circled above the skyline, broadcasting images of exhausted survivors emerging into falling snow beneath flashing rescue lights. Some people cried openly once they reached the street. Others simply stood staring upward at the skyscraper, as if they had just escaped something too large to fully understand. Inside the lower lobby, emergency blankets covered marble floors once prepared for luxury investors and champagne receptions. Now the room smelled like cold air, stress, and relief. Raymond Mercer walked through the lobby quietly nearly 40 minutes later, after emergency responders finally cleared him from the crown chamber. His jacket was torn at the shoulder. One hand remained wrapped in Sophie's yellow scarf, stained with grease and blood. The moment he entered the lobby, people noticed. Not dramatically. No cheering. No cinematic applause. Just stillness. A paramedic paused while opening a medical kit. A reporter slowly lowered her camera. One of the investors who laughed earlier stood up halfway from his chair before sitting back down awkwardly, unable to meet Ray's eyes. Even the police officers near the entrance stepped aside instinctively, because the balance of the room had changed. Ray looked exhausted. Older somehow, but calm. Always calm. Donna approached him first. For several seconds, she seemed unable to find words strong enough to survive the weight of her own embarrassment. Finally, she spoke quietly. "I should have listened to you." Ray adjusted the scarf around his injured hand carefully, then nodded once, not accepting victory, simply acknowledging truth. Donna's eyes lowered. "I filtered the raw oscillation data because the investors wanted cleaner reporting during launch week." Ray looked at her. "The tower almost died because people were afraid of ugly numbers. The sentence wasn't cruel. That made it worse." Dana swallowed hard. "I know." A long silence followed. Then Elliot Vane stepped forward. The entire lobby seemed to notice instantly. Hours earlier, he stood beneath chandeliers humiliating a construction worker in front of cameras and executives. Now he approached that same man with none of his old confidence left. His expensive coat hung open unevenly. Snow melted slowly across the shoulders from where he had briefly gone outside during the evacuation. And for the first time all night, Elliot looked human. Not powerful, not admired, just human. He stopped several feet from Ray. The lobby remained perfectly still. "I was wrong," Elliot said quietly. Ray said nothing. Elliot glanced toward the damaged scarf wrapped around Ray's hand, then back to his face. "I judged you before I understood you." Still nothing. No anger, no satisfaction. That silence forced Elliot to continue honestly. "I built towers my entire life, trying to make people look up at me." His voice weakened slightly. "And tonight, the only person anyone trusted was the man I treated like he didn't belong in the room." Somewhere behind them, a television replayed helicopter footage of the swaying skyscraper against the Chicago skyline. Ray finally spoke. "Buildings don't care about status." Elliot nodded slowly. "I know that now." Another silence settled over them. Then a security officer near the entrance looked toward the revolving doors suddenly. "Sir." Ray turned and saw Sophie. She stood just inside the lobby wearing winter boots and an oversized coat far too thin for the weather. One of her teachers stood beside her looking overwhelmed after bringing her downtown through police barricades. The moment Sophie saw Ray, her entire face changed. Relief first, then tears. She ran toward him immediately. Ray dropped to one knee despite the exhaustion tearing through his body. Sophie wrapped both arms around him carefully. "You missed the recital," she whispered into his shoulder. The words hurt more than the tower ever could. "I know." She pulled back enough to see the blood wrapped inside her yellow scarf. Her eyes widened. "Dad, I'm okay. Did you fix it?" Ray looked past her briefly, toward the exhausted survivors still leaving the building behind them, then down at his daughter, and answered softly, "I helped people get home." Sophie stared at him for one long second, then hugged him again, even tighter. Behind them, Elliot Vane quietly lowered his eyes, because at that moment he finally understood what dignity actually looked like. And it had nothing to do with skyscrapers. By sunrise, the Vane Meridian Tower stood quiet above Chicago. Still damaged, still scarred, but standing. Snow rested across the glass crown in pale silver streaks, while emergency crews continued inspecting structural sectors floor by floor beneath the fading red glow of warning lights. Television trucks remained parked along the streets surrounding the tower, their reporters speaking in hushed, dramatic tones about disaster narrowly avoided. But the city no longer looked at the skyscraper the same way. Neither did Elliot Vane. At 6:18 a.m., he stood alone inside the 86th floor ballroom, where the investor gala had nearly become a mass casualty event. The chandeliers hung motionless now. Broken glass had been swept into neat piles along the marble floor. Abandoned champagne flutes still rested across untouched tables beside emergency blankets forgotten in the chaos. The room smelled faintly of smoke-cold air and embarrassment. Elliot stared through the towering windows, overlooking the frozen Chicago River, while replaying the same memory over and over in his mind. "You lay bricks." The word sounded uglier now, smaller. Not because Raymond Mercer proved him wrong, because Ray never once tried to punish him for saying them. That was the part Elliot could not escape. A quiet knock interrupted the silence. Dana Halper entered carrying a tablet filled with overnight structural reports. "We stabilized the transfer frame," she said softly. "Permanent repairs will take months." Elliot nodded absently. Donna hesitated before continuing. "The press wants statements. So do the investors." Another pause. "And the city council." Elliot finally looked at her. "Tell them the truth." Dana blinked. "All of it." "Yes." He looked back toward the skyline, especially the ugly parts. For several seconds, Dana simply studied him, then quietly asked, "What happens to the tower now?" Elliot answered without hesitation. "We rebuilt it, honestly." The sentence sounded less like business and more like confession. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. 3 hours later, Raymond Mercer sat alone in a nearly empty hospital waiting area, while a nurse finished wrapping the cuts on his hand properly. Sophie slept curled beside him, across 2 chairs with her head resting against his shoulder. The yellow scarf, now cleaned as much as possible, covered both of them loosely, like a shared blanket. Ray stared silently through the window, while morning traffic crawled slowly through snow-covered streets below. Exhaustion pressed against him from every direction now that adrenaline had finally faded. His muscles hurt. His hands shook slightly when he moved too fast. And somewhere deep inside him existed the quiet, delayed terror that always came after survival. Not fear for himself, fear of how close he came to not returning home. Sophie shifted sleepily against him. "You're thinking too loud," she murmured without opening her eyes. A faint smile touched Ray's face. "Sorry, you always do that after bad days. This was a pretty bad day." That earned the smallest sleepy laugh. Then she looked up at him carefully. "You saved people. I helped. You always say that." Ray brushed hair gently away from her forehead. Because humility was easier than explaining responsibility to a child. A few minutes later, footsteps approached quietly down the hallway. Ray looked up. Elliot Vane stood near the waiting room entrance, holding 2 paper coffee cups awkwardly in one hand, like a man unused to carrying ordinary things himself. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Elliot walked over slowly and placed 1 cup beside Ray. "I wasn't sure how you take it." "Black's fine," I guessed. Ray nodded once. Sophie looked between them curiously. The famous architect who once filled magazine covers suddenly looked strangely tired, standing beneath fluorescent hospital lights. No audience, no cameras, no applause. Just a man carrying shame, honestly, for the first time in years. Elliot glanced toward Sophie. "You must be Sophie." She nodded cautiously. "I'm Elliot." "I know." That almost made him smile. Almost. Then he looked back toward Ray. "The board approved a full independent investigation this morning." Ray remained quiet. "We're removing every cost-cutting modification made to the stabilization systems." Still quiet. Elliot lowered his eyes briefly. "I also offered Dana's position to you." Sophie looked surprised. Ray didn't. Because people always tried rewarding visible heroism once the danger passed. But dignity had never been something Ray sold. "I'm not interested in executive offices," he said calmly. Elliot nodded slowly, as if he expected the answer already. "What are you interested in?" Ray looked toward the sleeping city outside the hospital window. Structures that tell the truth. Silence settled between them again. Then Elliot asked quietly, "Why didn't you humiliate me back?" The question sounded painfully sincere. Ray thought about it for a long moment. then finally answered, because Sophie was watching. Elliot looked at the yellow scarf wrapped loosely around Ray's injured hand, and something inside him seemed to collapse softly under the weight of that answer. Not guilt. Perspective. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Late that evening, after interviews, inspections, emergency statements, and endless city officials finally stopped demanding pieces of Raymond Mercer's time, he took Sophie down to the Chicago Riverwalk beneath the winter skyline. The air was cold enough to sting their lungs, but peaceful. For the first time in nearly 24 hours, no alarms screamed, no steel groaned, no radios begged for answers. The Vane Meridian Tower stood illuminated across the river, its upper crown still partially dark where emergency systems remained offline. Sophie sat beside Ray on a wooden bench overlooking the water. The yellow scarf wrapped around both of them together. For a while, neither spoke. They simply watched the reflections of skyscraper lights ripple softly across the river. Then Sophie leaned gently against his shoulder. "You know what I think?" "What?" "I think buildings are kind of like people." Ray glanced at her. "How?" "They look strong from far away," she said softly. "But if nobody listens when something hurts, eventually they break." Ray stared across the water silently, then nodded once, because after everything that happened, there was nothing to add, only truth. And somewhere across the frozen Chicago skyline, inside a tower built by pride and saved by quiet dignity, thousands of people went home alive because one tired bricklayer refused to stop listening. Sometimes, the strongest people in this world are not the loudest ones in the room. They are the people nobody notices. The tired father working overtime. The quiet worker everyone overlooks. The woman carrying invisible pain while still showing kindness to others. Real strength rarely arrives wearing expensive clothes or demanding attention. Most of the time, it arrives silently and keeps helping even after being disrespected. Ray's story reminds us of something powerful. Never judge someone by their job title, appearance, or status. Because wisdom, sacrifice, and greatness often hide behind ordinary faces. The people we ignore today may be the very people who save us tomorrow. But beyond the skyscraper, beyond the crisis, the true heart of this story was fatherhood. Ray didn't risk his life to prove he was smarter than anyone else. He did it because he wanted people to go home to the ones they loved. Because he wanted his daughter to grow up seeing what dignity looks like when the world becomes cruel. And maybe that's the real lesson. Your value does not decrease just because others fail to see it. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who judged you too quickly? And if you believe quiet people deserve more respect in this world, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more emotional cinematic stories about strength, sacrifice, family, and human dignity.